If you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza today, you have to crane your neck back until it actually hurts just to see the summit. It is a mountain of limestone, precise, geometric, and completely overwhelming. When you look at something that massive, built thousands of years before the wheel was even in common use, it is easy to feel a sense of total disbelief. It feels impossible. And that feeling of impossibility is exactly where the stories begin. For centuries, we have looked at the pharaohs of ancient Egypt and wondered if they were something more than us. The Egyptians themselves certainly thought so. To them, the pharaoh wasn't just a politician or a general. He was the literal vessel of the divine on earth. When a king took the throne, the spirit of Horus, the falcon-headed god, was believed to enter him. He became the living bridge between the mortal world and the heavens. But in the modern age, our imaginations have turned from the heavens to the stars. We look at the strange shapes of their skulls and carvings, the advanced engineering of their monuments, and we ask a different question. Were they extraterrestrial? It is a seductive idea. It appeals to that part of us that wants magic to be real. But the truth of the matter is actually a story of power, biology, and the incredible, sometimes tragic, lengths humans will go to for immortality.
To really understand where this alien theory comes from, you have to look at one specific moment in time and one very strange king named Akhenaten. If you walk through a museum and look at the statues of most pharaohs, they look like idealized bodybuilders. They have broad shoulders, square jaws, and perfect proportions. But Akhenaten was different. In his carvings, he is shown with a long, slender neck, a sagging potbelly, wide hips, and spindly, spider-like fingers. His head seems elongated, almost stretched backward. When you combine that distinct, almost non-human look with the fact that he completely overturned Egyptian religion to worship a disk in the sky, it is easy to see why people started whispering. Was he a hybrid? Was this the visual proof of extraterrestrial DNA? But the answer actually lies in the royal family tree, not the galaxy. The pharaohs were obsessed with keeping their divine bloodline pure. They believed that to maintain their power, they couldn't dilute the royal blood with commoners. So they married their sisters. They married their cousins. Akhenaten wasn't an alien. He was likely a product of severe genetic disorders resulting from generations of incest. Medical historians suggest he may have suffered from Marfan syndrome, which stretches the limbs and distorts the body. He wasn't extraterrestrial. He was a man physically suffering the consequences of his family's dangerous bid for perfection.
The most heartbreaking proof of this human frailty is actually found in Akhenaten's son, the famous boy king, Tutankhamun. When we found King Tut's tomb, the world was mesmerized by that death mask. It is gold, it is perfect, and it is serene. It stares out at eternity with unblinking confidence. But when we finally unwrapped the mummy beneath the gold, we didn't find a star child. We found a teenager who was physically falling apart. Tutankhamun had a clubfoot, he had a cleft palate, he suffered from malaria. His bones were necrotic and brittle. He couldn't even walk without a cane, dozens of which were buried right there beside him. He wasn't a superhuman being. He was a frail boy, born into a family tree that had become a straight line. So, to answer the question, were they descendants of gods? In their minds, absolutely. That belief gave them the authority to build a civilization that lasted 3,000 years. Were they descendants of aliens? No. But in a way, the reality is much more impressive. These weren't magical beings using laser tools. These were humans. They were frail, sickly, ambitious, and mortal humans who managed to convince the world they were divine. They mobilized thousands of people to stack millions of stones, creating monuments that have outlasted their gods and their empires. They weren't more than human. They were just humans who dreamed of being eternal. And through stone and story, they actually pulled it off.
It is interesting to think about why we cling to these stories. When we stand before the Great Pyramid, aligned almost perfectly to true north,
Or look at the heavy granite sarcophagi cut with laser-like precision. Our first instinct is often to say, humans couldn't have done that. But by crediting aliens or lost gods, we are actually doing something quite tragic. We are robbing our ancestors of their genius. We have found the villages where the builders lived. We know what they ate, mostly bread, beef, and a lot of thick beer. We even have their attendance records. We have ancient papyri where workers explained they missed a day of hauling stone because they were hungover, or because they were brewing beer, or caring for a sick wife. These were not mystical star beings. They were regular people with regular problems. But they were driven by a belief system that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. They believed that hauling those stones was an act of cosmic maintenance. If the Pharaoh's tomb wasn't finished, the sun might not rise. Chaos would swallow the earth. So were the Pharaohs gods? No. But they possessed a power that might be even stronger than advanced technology. They had the ability to unite an entire civilization around a single impossible goal. They didn't need anti-gravity rays to move mountains. They had purpose. And looking back from the modern world, that kind of unified human purpose feels almost more alien to us than the spaceships. Ultimately, the pharaohs spent their entire lives preparing for death. It was the absolute obsession of their culture. They hoarded gold, they dried their bodies in natron salts, and they built stone mountains to protect their souls from the silence of history. And here is the beautiful irony of it all. According to ancient Egyptian belief, you only truly died when your name was spoken for the last time. By that metric, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. We are here, right now, thousands of years later, still saying the names of Ramses, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. We are still debating their origins. We are still arguing over whether they were gods or star travelers. By wondering if they were more than human, we are giving them exactly the reverence they craved. They didn't actually have magic powers. They couldn't fly, and they didn't have alien blood running through their veins. But they understood something fundamental about human nature. They knew that if you build big enough and you dream loud enough, you can actually cheat death. So no, they weren't visitors from another planet. They were just us, terrified of being forgotten, and willing to move the earth itself to make sure they weren't. And looking at the pyramids against the setting sun today, you have to admit, it worked.
When we finally put aside the alien theories and the science fiction, we are left with something that is actually harder to explain than a spaceship. We are left with the sheer, terrifying force of human will. Think about it. We live in a world of instant gratification. If a web page takes 3 seconds to load, we get frustrated. But these god kings operated on a timeline of centuries. A pharaoh would start a massive temple complex, knowing for a fact that he would never see it finished. He would lay foundations for his grandchildren to build upon. That kind of long-term vision is almost alien to us now. Perhaps that is why we keep inventing these stories about extraterrestrials. It comforts us. It is easier to believe that a superior species came down and gave us the answers than to accept that we have simply lost that ability to focus, to unite, and to commit to things bigger than ourselves. The pharaohs prove that human beings are capable of impossible things when they share a single, unshakable belief. It doesn't matter if that belief, that the king controls the rain, was scientifically false. The result was real. The stone was moved. The desert was conquered. So the next time you see a picture of those jagged pyramids rising out of the sand, don't look for the landing pad. Look at the stones. Each one is a testament to what we can do when we stop looking at the sky for salvation and realize the power is actually right here, in our hands, in our sweat, and in our ability to dream together.
They weren't gobs, they weren't aliens. They were the first people to look at the impossible scale of the universe and say, I am going to build something that matters. And the fact that we are still talking about them today proves that, in the end, they were right. There is one final twist to this story.
By asking if the pharaohs were aliens, we are actually paying them the ultimate compliment. Think about it. If you build something so magnificent, so perfect, that thousands of years later people stand in front of it and say, a human couldn't have done that, you have won the game. The pharaohs understood the power of image better than any modern celebrity. They wore false beards strapped to their chins to look like the gods. They wore towering crowns to make themselves look taller. They covered their skin in oils and surrounded themselves with gold. It was all theater. It was a calculated performance designed to hide the fact that they were just men who bled, aged, and died like everyone else. And the performance was so convincing that we are still buying tickets to the show today. We stare at the hieroglyphs and look for spaceships because the alternative, that mere mortals achieve this perfection, is almost too hard for us to swallow. So, the answer isn't in the stars, it is in the psychology. They weren't visitors from above, they were the first masters of propaganda. They took their fragile, mortal lives and wrapped them in so much grandeur that they tricked history itself. They weren't gods, and they weren't aliens. They were just the greatest storytellers the world has ever seen. And their story was so good, we are still debating if it was real.
If you ever get the chance to walk into the Royal Mummies Hall in Cairo, you should take it. It is a very specific, very quiet experience. You walk past the glass cases, and suddenly you are face to face with the legends we have been talking about. You aren't looking at a statue or a carving. You are looking at a person. You can see the texture of their skin, the curve of their fingernails, and sometimes even the henna still dyeing their hair. It is shockingly intimate. When you look into the actual face of Ramses the Great, you don't see a gray alien or a glowing god. You see an old man. You see a man who probably had back pain, who had bad teeth, and who worried about his children. This physical reality is the final nail in the coffin for the alien theory, but it opens a door to something much better. It connects us to them. If they were aliens, then the pyramids belong to the stars. Their achievements would be nothing more than advanced technology given to primitive pets. But because they were human, those achievements belong to us. They belong to our shared history. It proves that we as a species are capable of greatness that echoes for millennia. The magic isn't in their DNA. It is in what they did with the short, fragile time they had. They took the universal fear of death and they turned it into art. They took the chaos of the world and ordered it into stone. They were flesh and blood, just like us, and that is exactly what makes them so extraordinary.
In the end, the question of whether the pharaohs were gods or aliens says much more about us than it does about them. We live in an age where we have largely separated ourselves from the miraculous. We understand the weather, we have mapped the genome, and we have been to the moon. The world has become smaller, more explained, and perhaps a little more cynical. So when we look back at the sands of Egypt, we see a gap we can't quite bridge. We see a people who lived in a world alive with magic, where every sunrise was a battle won, and every river flood was a divine gift. We have lost that specific sense of wonder, so we try to fill the gap with science fiction. We insert aliens because we have forgotten what spiritual conviction looks like. But the truth is simpler and far more profound. The pharaohs were the ultimate expression of the human refusal to accept limits. They looked at their mortal bodies, fragile and temporary, and they simply said, "No, I will not disappear." They didn't descend from the sky. They rose from the mud of the Nile. They were built from the exact same DNA as you and me, and that is the most inspiring part of the whole story. It means that the capacity to build mountains, to align with the stars, and to be remembered for eternity isn't a superpower. It isn't extraterrestrial. It is deeply, beautifully human. And as long as the Sphinx keeps watch over the Giza Plateau, staring silently at the rising sun, they will be there to remind us of exactly what we are capable of when we dare to believe we are more than just dust.